Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, an organization that we affectionately call WRAG. We support the philanthropic sector in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and in the District of Columbia. In 2016, we embarked upon a learning journey to explore the depth and breadth and impact of structural racism and implicit bias. We called it Putting Racism on the Table. 2 years later, we asked our members if this learning journey had made a difference. We were pleased when they reported that 36% are now doing their grant making using a racial equity lens, and an additional 34% is considering that strategy. And while we know that philanthropy can definitely be catalytic, we also know that philanthropy alone will not make this a racially equitable region. So we have partnered with Leadership Greater Washington to expand the table for racial equity. We are joining with nonprofit leaders and with business leaders to again look at issues around structural racism and implicit bias. We are delighted that you are a part of this learning journey. Next, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, author of What Does It Mean to Be White, will explore the topic of white privilege.
Well, good morning. It was very invigorating to walk here in the snow this morning I'm used to rain, but not snow. And as I was standing there listening, I was thinking, do you all realize how lucky you are? I'm involved in a lot of professional development programs. This one is exceptional. And it is a deep honor to follow Ibram Kendi. It also sets me up so beautifully because he laid the groundwork of the historical context, and I'm going to pick that up from today, and we're going to focus on the other side of that relationship, which would be dominant culture or the white side. And I open with this quote by Ijeoma Oluo, who is local to Seattle where I live, because it helps set that frame. Right? So as someone, oh, by the way, let me draw your attention to my race. I'm white, everybody. Check me out in case you hadn't noticed or been thinking about it. And of course, part of being white is that goes against all my socialization, to be drawing your attention to my race and to be proceeding as if it had any meaning, or as if you could know anything about me just because I'm white. So what if I'm white? Right? What does that have to do with anything? Well, I am very clear today that I'm white, that I have a white frame of reference, I have a white worldview, and I move through the world with a white experience. And it is not just a universal human experience, as I was taught. It is most particularly a white experience in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, right? And so when I grew up, I didn't think of myself in racial terms, right? I understood somebody had race, but not really me, right? So we're going to unpack that today, and we're going to focus on who may not be the majority of the people in this room, and that's an interesting dynamic, right? When the topic is race, that's one of the few times you may see less white people in the room, but generally, any table where decisions are made that affect the lives of people that aren't at that table, generally it will be overwhelmingly white. And so that's who I'm going to focus on in our short time together. What I hope is valuable for the folks of color in this room is that I'm going to name and admit to things in our short time together that white people will rarely ever name or admit to. And if you've ever scratched your head wondering, how do they pull this off? Could they really not see this? I'll help you with that. And to the degree that that's validating of your experience, to the degree that it helps you navigate us, because while I can get away with not knowing your experience, you really can't avoid not knowing mine, right? For the white folks in the room, I offer you a couple of challenges. And the first is that I have never met a white person who did not have an opinion on the topic of racism. Have you? If you're not sure that all white people have an opinion on the topic of racism, just bring it up the next time you're around a bunch of white people. Maybe tonight when you go to dinner in DuPont Circle, and see how that goes. Right? But I have opinion on many things that I also recognize are not informed. And I'm going to say perhaps my first provocative thing. If you are white, I understand you have a perspective on this topic, and I don't know you. I don't know your experiences, your travels, your relationships, your commitments, your studies. And yet I'm confident to say the following. If you are white and you have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus on this topic, your opinions are necessarily very limited. Now, how can I say that when I don't know you? Because nothing in dominant culture gives you the information you would need to have the complex, nuanced understanding of arguably the most complex, nuanced social dilemma since the beginning of this country. You can get through graduate school in this country without discussing racism, can you not? You can get through law school in this country without discussing racism. You can get through teacher education in this country without discussing racism. You can be seen as qualified to lead a major or minor institution in this country with no understanding of the perspectives or experiences of people of color. Can you not? And you can claim not to understand that, and up until recently, get away with that, right? But our time is up. Right? If we cannot engage with complexity and nuance with this topic, we are not going to be seen as qualified in the way that we could get away with it in the past. You might recall a couple of years back, the president of the University of Missouri college system lost his job because he was being challenged by athletes of color, and he just said, gosh, I don't know anything about this. Clearly felt confident to make that claim, but lost his job over that. So we're really being called to be accountable. And in some ways you might look at our present government and say, I'm not so sure. But what I would say is if you want to be a leader in this field, you're going to have to grapple. And so the very first challenge is one of humility. Just listen with humility and listen to grapple and to try on, okay? All right, well, Ibram Kendi made a beautiful foundation of the understanding of racism as a structure rather than an event, right? As a system rather than a moment. And when you understand racism as a system or a structure, you ask a different question. So dominant culture defines racism as an individual act that mean individual does intentionally, right? And so that's the question that gets asked by dominant culture. Was that or wasn't that racism? And if that's your question, you're going to set up a binary argument that will never be resolved. When you understand that it is a structure or system and the one that we are in, you ask a different question. And your question becomes, it's 24/7, 365, it's the water we're swimming in, it's the foundation of the culture and all of its institutions. So how was it manifesting in that situation, in that context, in that moment? It's a very different question, right? And while all groups of color, all groups who are not perceived or defined as white in this culture experience racism, and I really believe that in order to understand, to gain racial literacy, so let me just say, as a white person, I was raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of racism. Right? To gain literacy, you have to understand how racism manifests differently for different groups. What I've internalized about Asian heritage people, for example, is different than what I've internalized about African heritage people, and then my responses are different. Having said that, I believe there is something profoundly anti-Black in this culture, and that the ultimate racial other in the white mind is Black. And when I want white people to get in touch with that sense of racial otherness, I ask you to think about Black people, African Americans. And I want to give you just one glance at the trajectory of anti-Blackness in this country since the beginning. And this slide is deliberately dense because we can think about it literally as state-sanctioned organized crime. And it begins with 246 years of kidnapping, enslavement, torture, rape, and brutality, and it carries on. And about a third of the way through, you see bans on testifying against whites, which made it functionally legal to murder black people. And you are now in my lifetime. And that's very important because a lot of white people seem to think that racism ended upon the ending of slavery. Right? So we're in my lifetime at that point, and then we can pick it up at employment discrimination, and we are in 2018 with copious empirical evidence. So let's pick it up there. Employment discrimination, educational discrimination, bias laws and policing practices, white flight, cultural erasure, subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, disparate special ed referrals and punishments, testing, tracking, school funding, racist media representation, untold history, and so much more. It is a structure, not an event. It's the structure we're in, and nothing could and nothing did exempt any person in this room from its forces. And this is another challenge I offer to white people because I've been doing this a long time, and I know that many who are listening are thinking, yeah, but not me. Because here's why I'm different from what she's saying. And every time you have that thought, I want you to practice saying, okay, my experience was different than the pattern she's naming right now. So rather than seeing that as having exempted me from the forces of racism, how did it set me up? It set me up differently than another white person got set up, but it still set me up. Okay? And let me also say that African Americans are not and have never been in the position to do this to white people. White people have always been and continue to be in the position to do this to African Americans. There is no such thing as reverse racism. By definition, racism describes a structure of unequal institutional power. Well, how are we socialized to think about racism? Well, this is just one image that I thought beautifully captured the reality of not knowing our history. So this is from last year's College Jeopardy Champion Playoff. So those are our best and our brightest, and that's the board at the end of the Grand Champion round. And as we can see, there's one category now. One of them touched, so clearly the hardest, and nobody was going to risk losing. You know, and I actually can't put words to the profundity of this disconnect. On a couple of levels. First of all, if you cannot trace the past into the present, you're going to be left with some very problematic explanations for current conditions, explanations that blame victims, right? And the other thing that's really problematic about this is this separation. This is the history of this country. It's not their history. It didn't occur in a vacuum, right? Because you know what's under that category, right? Civil War and civil rights. That's what's always under that category, as if it could ever be separated from the fabric of the entire culture. So what are we taught racism is? Well, post-civil rights, racism made a beautiful adaptation, a brilliant adaptation, quite a simple one, but quite brilliant in its impact. All systems of oppression are highly adaptive. They get challenged, they push back. And I know Ibram Kendi made that point very beautifully, right? And so post-civil rights, a racist became reduced to a very simple formula of an individual who consciously does not like people based on race and intentionally sets out to be mean to them. And if that is your definition of a racism, I cannot imagine any person in this room would identify with it, right? And if that's your definition of a racist, and I can't loosen that definition for you, you're not going to enjoy this talk. And it just functions beautifully to protect racism. Because I think this definition, this simplistic definition of individuals who are mean and know it, is the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. Have you all noticed any white defensiveness on this topic? Just curious. It's made it virtually impossible to talk to the average white person about the inevitable absorption of a racist worldview that we get because we're raised in a racist culture, right? And so let me just put it really directly. As a result of being born and raised in the United States, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist patterns. I have developed investments in the system of racism because it has served me so well. And I'm also invested in not seeing any of that because it interferes with my identity, and also it would require change. Now, I don't put that out as that's how I was raised. I'm working against it. But this will be lifelong because every moment I push against that conditioning, it's coming back at me. So let me unfold a case for what I just said. And we'll start with filling in this either or binary, right? So post-civil rights, a racist became a bad person. And we know how to fill this in, right? They're ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, they're old, they're Southern, they drive pickup trucks, we gotta get some classism in there. And not racist are good. And they're educated, progressive, open-minded, well-intended, young, Northern, shop at Whole Foods. No, actually we don't shop at Whole Foods because that's a corporation. We shop at the local co-op. All right. You will notice that I like to poke a little fun at white progressives. As I was introduced as crunchy, it's true. When I first applied for a position to lead people in racial dialogues, I thought, well, of course I'm qualified. I'm a vegetarian. I mean, how could I be racist? That was the 90s. That was pretty alternative in the 90s. Today I would need to be a vegan. But nonetheless, this idea that this is all it is openness. I actually think white progressives, and a white progressive is anyone who's white who thinks, not me. I'm cool, I'm down, I'm woke. That is a white progressive, and I actually think we're the most difficult for people of color. Because the degree to which we think we're good to go, that's when we even bother to worry about racism, since it's not our problem, we're not racist, we're going to put all our energy into making sure you know we're good to go. And none of it into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, which is continual, ongoing, critical self-awareness, education, relationship building, mistake making, and actual strategic, intentional anti-racist action. So let's get rid of this. We cannot get where we need to go from this paradigm. And do notice, our outcomes have not changed. Racial disparity has not changed, and in some areas it is getting worse. So this idea of open-mindedness is not actually changing racism. So we have to start thinking a little more critically about what might be going on. Right? And so in doing this work, I hear the same narratives day in and day out from white people. And as I listen to these narratives, I've thought, oh my God, it's like a script. Right? I can predict what's going to be said here. And it is a script in that we're products of our socialization, we're products of culture. And as I listened, I got this image. I tend to think in metaphors. So I got this image of a dock, and it signifies two things for me. First of all, it's just floating on the top of the water, right? So all of this, all of these narratives that we say are so superficial. Right? So it just signifies how surface or superficial all of this is. But also it indicates that this dock is resting on something, right? It looks like it's just floating there, but it's not just floating there. There's a whole structure underneath that dock that props it up. There are actual pillars embedded in the ocean floor holding that dock up. And we've got to get off the top, off the surface, and get under there and examine those pillars. Because what we're saying on the surface isn't changing what's underneath, isn't changing our outcomes. And I think about these narratives as in two overall sets, colorblind and color celebrate. So let's start with the colorblind set. Probably the number one of these narratives is, I was taught to treat everyone the same. Anybody ever heard that one? Okay. Not one single person in this room was taught to treat everyone the same. It's not humanly possible. You cannot be taught to treat everyone the same. You do not treat everyone the same. You can be told. I get it. Your parents might have lectured you to do that. You can't actually do it. You're a human being. And there is no human objectivity. And you don't even want to treat everyone the same because people have different needs. So when I hear this from a white person, there's a bubble over my head. And it says, oh, This person doesn't understand basic socialization. This person doesn't understand culture. This person is not particularly self-aware. And I need to tell something to the white folks. And when people of color hear us say this, they're generally not thinking, all right, I am talking to a woke white person right now. You can check me if I'm wrong, but usually some version of eye rolling is going on. Oh, here we go, right? It's not doing what we think it's doing. And all of these are really kind of, I don't see it, or if I see it, it has no meaning, right? My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. My parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. Doesn't matter what comes first, what comes second must be, I am not. Children are so much more open, so innocent today. I'm really sorry to say that the research shows that all children who grow up here understand by age 3 to 4 that it is better to be white. They do not miss the message. Not a person in this room missed this message, and your children and grandchildren didn't miss it either. And it's not a singular, isolated message, it's relentless. Again, I will give you some examples in a bit. So when we project this racial innocence onto children, we leave them unattended to that message. I think parents of color understand that, but the impact when white parents do it is very different. Well, so-and-so just happened to be black, but it has nothing to do with why no one in our department gets along with her. And this is another one along with reverse. I ask folks to remove from their vocabulary anything that begins with just happened to be, regardless of race. Well, yes, but on the human level, we can all agree. Because what you do when you make that move, besides taking race off the table, is you position some kind of shared experience. And there is not a shared experience in the here and now in a deeply separate and unequal by race society and context. And really, you impose your reality. I might not know what race has to do with my response to my coworker, but I need to be willing to grapple with how race is shaping my response, because all the research and implicit bias shows it's shaping my response. So I call these colorblind, again, because they claim not to see or not to it doesn't have any meaning. And so there is a question that has never failed me in my work to uncover how all this functions. Okay? And that question is not, is this true or is this false? Is this right or is this wrong? We're never going to get to agreement if we ask binary questions like that. The question that has never failed me is, how does this function in the conversation? And if we apply that question, I think we can see that all of these narratives function to exempt the person from any further engagement, exempt them from any part of the problem or dynamic. Take race off the table. Nothing to see here, let's move on. In doing that, they close rather than open the exploration, and in doing that, they protect the racial hierarchy and the white position within it. This may not be a conscious, intentional move, but it is how it impacts the conversation. Okay. Well, I would imagine if you've been attending these sessions, you're not in colorblind mode. So what do the white progressives say? Well, we say things like this. Oh, I work in a very diverse environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have people of color in my family. Me? I'm not racist. I used to live in New York. This one gets used interchangeably with, I'm not racist, I'm from Canada. I'm not racist, I'm from Europe. I'm not racist, I'm from Hawaii. And I'm not racist, I was in the military. Because apparently there are no racists in those places, or no racism, so you might want to get to New York and enlist. Sociologists actually have a name for this one. It's called the inoculation case. I've been near people of color, and it stripped me of my racism. And I want you to notice how often white people use proximity to people of color as their evidence of a lack of racism. It's really interesting because it helps reveal how we define racism. And this is important. because we so rarely think critically about what we're saying and what structure it rests on. So let's do a little discourse analysis. Discourse analysis is the study or the critical study of language and how it functions. Right? So how many of you in a conversation with a white person on race and racism have heard some version of these? Okay, and if we're being really honest, we've said some version of these. Okay, right? So when the topic of racism comes up and a white person says something like this, they're giving you their evidence, right? Racism comes up, I say this is my evidence. In my mind, what is this my evidence of? What do I want to make sure you know? I'm not racist, right? That's not even a stretch, right? White people say this to show that they are not racist. So if this is my evidence of a lack of racism, if this is what distinguishes me from a racist, then apparently a racist can't do these things. Okay? So apparently a racist couldn't work 3 cubicles down from a person of color. I'm going to ask the people of color in the room a rhetorical question. Could a racist work 3 cubicles down from? Apparently could not have people of color in their family. Another rhetorical question I want to ask the folks of color. Do you have white people in your life who you loved dearly and who on occasion run their unaware racism and racist assumptions at you? Okay, so for our listeners out there, they're nodding, yes. And I'm pretty sure a racist could live in New York, okay? I'll leave it at that. So if this is your evidence, then your definition of a racist is that a racist cannot tolerate the mere sight of a person of color, could not be near people of color, could not work. And I think right here we're seeing that this is rather absurd, and that even a card carrying, I named that I am a product of my culture, and so I have racism. I'm not a card carrying avowed racist, but even one of them could do all these things and likely does. Have you ever seen those TV shows where a black reporter is interviewing an openly white supremacist Nazi? You ever seen those shows? Well, they're out there. Everybody's calm. They can talk to people of color, right? So again, if we ask ourselves a couple questions, what definitions does this rest on? I think we can see it rests again on that really, really simplistic formulated understanding of what a racist is. Right? And we have a few more here. I already know all this. I mean, I've been to Costa Rica. I took that class in college. Honestly, any white person who says to me, I already know all this, is telling me that they don't, or they would never say such an arrogant thing. I will spend my life working on this, and I will never be finished. I was in the Peace Corps. Right? I tutored on the reservation. Well, we don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. What could we do? Actually, I think that's disingenuous. I think we do like how white our neighborhoods are. That's another talk. But you notice, right, these are colors celebrate. I love it. I embrace it. And again, if we ask true, false, right, wrong, we're not going to be able to get anywhere. But if we ask, intentionally or not, how do these narratives function in the conversation, I think we can see they function the same way as colorblind narratives function. They exempt the person from any part of the problem. They take race off the table. They close rather than open the exploration. And in doing that, they protect the current racial order and the white position within it. Right? They're not in practice any more progressive than colorblind narratives. Right? If you're having feelings coming up right now, or thoughts or reactions, practice holding them. Practice not reacting from them, and use them as a door in to your socialization, right? How can my reaction help me understand how I make meaning and what might be challenging about this, okay? So we have to get under there and really look at again, what is holding this up, because it isn't changing our outcomes, right? Okay. So I know that you've gone through these 3 questions. How diverse was your neighborhood? How diverse were your teachers? What are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? And I want to share just the overall pattern is that if you are white, you most likely grew up in racial segregation. That white people live the most segregated lives. Overwhelmingly, we live segregated lives. And I also want you to notice the discursive power of calling a segregated neighborhood, as long as it's white, a good neighborhood, a safe neighborhood, a sheltered neighborhood. These are powerful shapers of our identity, and they're also powerful messages to people of color. The vast majority of teachers reflect the white students, right? They impart a worldview. They hold great power over who goes where, who's seen in what ways. They answer these questions the same way most other white people answer these questions. And a friend of mine puts it like this, and it always gets me, so I'm going to do it. Pretty much all of us have been taught by white people, who've been taught by white people, who've been taught by white people, who've been taught by white people, using textbooks written for, by, and about white people. I want you to just start getting the weight of that white worldview, of that socialization, and it's so much deeper than I'm friendly to my coworker and I'm aware of it. So I'm going to speak to that last question. This is my book. And a couple of patterns that come up oftentimes when you ask white people, what are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? The first pattern is that's a really uncomfortable question for us to answer. 2, we don't tend to be able to answer it with much criticality at all. And we bring that lack of criticality to the table with us. And people of color know that most of us cannot answer that question with any criticality. And it's part of what they have to navigate with us. It's part of what contributes to a culture that may not feel very supportive to people of color, even though I'm completely oblivious to why that might be. Okay? And then 3rd, when we do answer this question, we tend to focus our answer on people of color. So in that exercise, those of you who did it, white people will often tell a story about a cross-racial interaction or friendship or moment. And I find that really interesting in what it reveals. It reveals, again, how deeply we define race as what they have and as what is at play when they are present. It's always in relation to people of color, and how difficult it is for us to think about ourselves outside of people of color in racial terms. Okay? So here's how I would begin to answer this question. When my mother was pregnant with me, what environmental safety she had the choice to live in and carry that pregnancy. Just think Flint, Michigan. What kind of nutrition was available to my mother where she carried me? What kind of transportation was available to her? What kind of education? Where could I be delivered? I live in Seattle, Washington. At the time of my birth, there were only 2 hospitals that would allow African Americans to deliver there. How was my mother treated in the hospital during my delivery? Who delivered me? Who owned the hospital? And who came in that night and mopped the floor? I was born into a racial hierarchy, the forces of which were operating on me before I ever took my first breath, so that we could literally predict whether my mother and I would survive my birth based on my race, and every breath I've taken since has shaped my life. So what I'm about to lay out, every other white person in this room can say, and no person of color in this room can say. And this is important not because it makes us good or bad, but because if we don't understand how it's shaping us, we're going to keep reproducing the same dynamics that cause people of color so much daily stress. So I was born into a culture in which I belong. In virtually any situation deemed normal, neutral, or certainly valuable, I belong. I belonged in my childbirth class, for sure. I belonged dealing with my daughter's teachers, her camp counselors. I belong at the church service. I belong at the block party, at the administration table, the leadership table. I belong at that wedding. How many of you have been to a wedding? If it wasn't all white, it was pretty close. Okay, so almost everybody's raising their hands. It could have been our own weddings. Just notice that, because it speaks to two things. One, your wedding, big or small, is your circle. And it speaks to how separate we live our lives. But also, it's never me at the wedding carrying the psychic burden of racialization. Right? Well, I'm representing the halls of power. And we get to the halls of power, it's very difficult to separate gender from race. But racially, I'm represented. I put the statistic there about white men to make the point that it's always about institutional power, not about numbers. Right? So, House of Representatives, 78% white. U.S. Senate, 90% white. And I'm going to show you a series of photos now, and where you see the yellow border around the picture, those are the people of color in that group. These are from 2016. These are U.S. senators, leaders of the largest U.S. companies, U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. governors, U.S. top military advisors, people who decide which TV shows we see, people who choose which movies get made, people with the most influence over which books we read, people who decide which music gets produced, people who decide what news is covered, owners of men's pro football teams, owners of men's pro baseball teams, owners of men's pro basketball teams, presidents of Ivy League universities, 95 of the top 100 directors of the top 100 grossing films of all time. I don't know who that is, I just Googled white guy. 99 of them men. By definition, institutional power is the ability to disseminate your worldview to everyone, to shape how they see themselves, how they see you, and how they see themselves in relationship to you, and to be able to disseminate that worldview, to tell not only your story, but their stories, even when you are not in relationship with them. You'll have to trust me, I didn't pick this picture to pick on Paul Ryan. I picked this picture because when I saw it, this is what it means to be white. In so many ways, on so many days, this is my life. So this is Paul Ryan and his incoming interns. These are our future politicians. And I want you to think about the schools they likely went to, the neighborhoods they likely grew up in, the teachers they had, their friendship circles. And then I want you to think about the tables that they're going to sit at and the decisions they're going to make that are going to affect the lives of people that they don't know, who they have had to depend on deeply problematic understandings of. Right? And now I want you to imagine that these are our future medical researchers. And now imagine that these are our future teachers, our future social workers, our future lawyers and judges. Maybe you begin to get the weight of whiteness. It is a particular worldview and a particular experience. It is not universal. Well, I was raised Catholic, and I don't know if there's a more powerful image than God. And we're into iconography in Catholicism. So this is what I saw when I looked up. There's God creating man. There's Jesus and Mary. Right? And I didn't look up as a child and go, oh, God is white. Right? I just never have to. It's that relentless reflection. And Mary is really big in Catholicism, especially if you're Italian and Catholic. And we are told Mary is the mother of God. Can you imagine being the mother of God? And look at her. She wasn't white. Neither was Jesus. But how powerful to render her white. This is on a science website. What would a scientifically perfect face look like? And if Dr. Kinde talked about scientific racism, this is kind of keeping that in circulation. This I saw on CNN, most beautiful women from around the world and representing South Africa. This is where I introduced the term white supremacy. I'm very, very comfortable with the term. I don't use it to talk about extremists. I use it because it's a highly descriptive sociological term for the culture we're in. White as supreme, as superior, as the ideal. And for me to use her to represent South Africa is a cogent example. By the way, there wasn't a single Asian woman in this spread. Asian women are the majority of all women on our planet. Constant messages, it's better to be white. Children don't miss these. Here's an example. This is 2015's cover of People. World's Most Beautiful Woman. Ah, that's silly, and I cannot miss this when I go to any checkout stand. 2015's, there's 2016's World's Most Beautiful Woman. Here's 2017, World's Most Beautiful Woman. And you know, Julia Roberts is so beautiful that in the whole wide world, they had to go back to her 5 times. She is a 5-time winner. And I want you to just take that in, right? I mean, I might look at those magazines and think, oh, I wish I was younger. But the fundamental frame, I've always been inside. Right? I'm not fundamentally outside the frame. The ultimate signifier of ideal beauty is whiteness. This is an ad I got on a Delta in-flight magazine last year, and the first thing that struck me about this ad is, whoo, look at the racial hierarchy in that ad. The Asian women in the middle wearing yellow, the black women in the back wearing brown, and then I looked more closely, and it's an ad for a purse. Look at the black women's hands. They're empty. They don't have the purse. And you know, ads are powerful and subliminal, and you only have to glance at it. But we're constantly being given messages about status, hierarchy, and relation to resources. Well, I was racially affirmed throughout my childhood, as are all white children today. Enough said. That message isn't missed on any little girl. These are last year's top 5 runners-up for Miss Teen USA. And yes, those are 5 different girls. You have to concentrate, but if you, North Carolina, Nevada, Texas, you know, again, you can just take that in, right? And then this is the group that they were drawn from. And as usually happens, there'll be 1, maybe 2, right, in the back or to the side. And because I know my people, I am confident that for all those white girls, that one black girl is their evidence for why they're not racist. Because everybody loved her. Nobody had a problem with her. Now get that young woman in a room and debrief her with someone she trusts, and I can't imagine what that experience was like, right? And I want to move these white girls way past this really superficial understanding that were you or weren't you friendly to the black girl? And I want to get them to an understanding of what's going on here, what is being reproduced, how is it shaping you, and what role are you going to play as you go forward to continue it if you don't understand it, right? How are you going to bring all of this to the table with you if you can't see it? A lot of white folks who experience challenges or face barriers have trouble owning the advantages of being white. So I want to be really clear that I grew up in poverty, and I mean that straight up. I grew up in poverty, homelessness, foster care, a deep sense of shame. I was a Catholic female. I'm a cisgender female. I have had struggles and barriers. I didn't go to college until I was in my 30s. But I always knew I was white. Please. I don't have less racism because I grew up poor. I don't have more either. I learned my place in the racial hierarchy from a different class position than a middle class girl learned hers, but I learned it. And being white has very much helped me make it in academia, right? So think about it as the absence of that struggle. It doesn't mean we don't struggle. So these are all shows that were hugely popular that take place across the decades. These are television shows about ideal friendship. Many of us grew up with. So we had Seinfeld in the 80s. We had Sex and the City in the 90s. Friends was the 2000s. And there was Gossip Girl. And then the latest show that just ended its 6th season was Girls. So these are hugely popular, exported worldwide television shows about ideal friendship. Y'all remember these shows? Every one of them takes place in New York City. You know, over and over and over, the message to me is that the ideal world is white, and that even amongst diversity, there's no actual value in an integrated life. And yes, I've internalized it. I couldn't not internalize that. Right? So I think perhaps the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is that I could be born into, I could learn, I could play, I could worship, I could study, I could love, I could work, and I could die in racial segregation. And not one person in my life who's ever loved or mentored me has ever conveyed that I've lost anything of value. I want you to take that in if you're white, because that's the deepest message of all. I could literally go to my grave with few, if any, authentic, sustained relationships with people of color, and no one has suggested any loss whatsoever to me. My wedding looked a lot like that. Most of us raised our hands. We've been to weddings like that. Why would my funeral not look like that? Well, it won't, because I've worked very, very hard. But just following the trajectory laid out for us by our loving parents in our good schools, good neighborhoods, good careers, most of us, our lives will end this way, most of us who are white. In fact, white people measure the value of our spaces by the absence of people of color. I know exactly what a good school is. I know why it's a good school. I know what a good neighborhood is. I know what makes it a good neighborhood. I know when a neighborhood's coming up, what's making it come up, and I know when it's going down. White people measure the value of our spaces by the absence of people of color. These are powerful messages. Powerful, right? That there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. And we bring it to the table with us, right? My psychosocial development was inculcated in this water. This is the water of white supremacy, white superiority. It's not about being good or bad. I didn't want it. I didn't choose it. I don't even like it, not at a conscious level anyway. And I've committed my life to challenging it. But nothing could have exempted me from it. So if we go back and we identify those pillars of what sociologists call new racism, how we keep getting the same outcomes, even though almost all white people would adamantly reject the label of racist, and certainly any complicity with racism. I think this is what allows us to pull this off, right? The good-bad binary, fabulously effective at protecting racism and keeping us defensive and pushing back against any connection. Implicit bias, which you cannot help but absorb. And notice that I focus on what I think of as the banality of white superiority, because I think it's the hardest for us to own and admit to. But there's a whole nother level of straight up, ugly, racist stuff that all white people are exposed to. Any white person who comes up to me and says, never in my life have I heard a racist joke or comment, I just say, yeah, I don't believe that. There's no way. That's another layer, right, that's in there. And then individualism, this precious ideology of individualism. For a lot of white people, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning will set us off. We do not like being generalized about. Yeah, you're an individual. You're also a member of a group where we can predict how long you'll live, right? We have to be able to grapple with that also. Universalism is a sense that we represent everyone and can speak for everyone. Internalized superiority, and on some level an investment in a system that's pretty comfortable, right? And then the power of segregation to hold it all in place. And maybe not on the, even if at immediate level our lives are not segregated, certainly the society at large. And I do want to, any white person sitting here thinking of their 2, 3, 4, or 5 friends of color and how that exempts you, I want you to notice the response of the folks of color in the room when I asked, do you have close, loving friendships with white people who still, on occasion, expose their unaware racist assumptions? And they nodded, right? It's better than not having relationships. It's part of our work is to build those relationships, but it doesn't free us. I think about it like this. As a result of this work, I do less harm. I run less racism. I still step in it on occasion. I'm not defensive at all when I do it, and I have very good repair skills. But I'm not going to be free of these patterns. So these are a lot of the patterns that all of this sets up in white people, right? So I've gone over a lot of these, so I'll just lightly touch on ones I might not have spoken to. Not understanding that we bring our group's history with us, right? We often expect to be responded to as individuals, right? As unique individuals. And people of color are like, yeah, you're Robin and you're a white woman. And I'm aware of that. And there's a history of harm between us, between our groups. And you'll actually need to earn my trust and show me you're different, not demand my trust and tell me you're different. Right? Inability to sustain long-term relationships, wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions. Just give me the answer. Guilt. Focusing on intentions over impact. Right? These are all really common patterns that all of this kind of sets up in us. Right? And that leads to what I think of as white fragility. So all of this causes us to not respond very well when any of this is named in ourselves, right? In my experience in a room like this, you guys are with me, but then if I were to point out a particular person's problematic racist assumption in the room, it wouldn't go very well. So as long as it's on the abstract level, we're okay with it. But we tend to have a very strong reaction to somebody connecting us individually and personally to it. So we're fragile in the sense that it doesn't take much to set us off, right? As I said, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning will set us off, or that being white grants advantage. So we're fragile in that way. But the response is incredibly powerful, right? You've thrown me off my racial equilibrium. You've thrown me off my racial comfort zone. You've challenged my very identity as a good person, and I need you to stop that, and I need to get back into my comfort zone. And I'll do whatever it takes to do that. So if I need to cry, I'll cry, and then you'll be bad, and everyone will comfort me. All right. If I need to get my back up, if I need to storm out of the room, if I need to shut down and start avoiding you, whatever it takes to have you back off, right? And in that, it's not fragile at all. I think white fragility actually functions as a kind of white racial bullying. We make it so miserable for people of color to talk to us about our inevitable and often unaware racist patterns that most of the time they don't bother because it isn't worth it. It's probably going to get worse for them. And in that way, it's an incredibly effective form of white racial control. I am not the 1%. I've never even been a manager. But I can control the people of color in my orbit. You stay in your place, and I'll stay in mine. And then you'll get to be with me. But you challenge me, and pretty soon you're going to be a problem. You're going to be difficult. And in that, and of course behind my reaction is leveraging just the weight of all that institutional power and history, right? White fragility. This is the House Freedom Caucus. Arguably the most powerful committee in the nation, right? And I chose this picture because for me this is just the amplification of white male power. Right? These are incredibly powerful men. They're all white. They're wearing suits. They're conservative. right? Because I really want to amplify the dynamics, and maybe where you sit, because of course I'm going to ask you to think about how these dynamics relate to your purview, but this makes it really, really clear. Right? So imagine that what they're doing at the table right now is writing the new health care bill. And they've just gotten to the part on women's reproductive health. Just pause. And then one of them says, maybe we should have a woman in here. Right? And now, they don't all think they need a woman in there. But about a year or two later, they finally agree. Okay? I'm amplifying the dynamics. Okay? Again, I want you to look at them, and I want you to notice that they don't seem to be concerned that there are no women in that group. And right now, we're going to focus on women, and then we'll move to race. So for now, we're going to do gender, right? It's an example of the internalization of an absence of loss and an absence of seeing value in the perspectives of women. I don't think they could be at that table comfortably and not notice if they hadn't at a deep level an internalization of superiority. Right? And imagine now they do need to they finally agreed that they should get a woman, and so what they're really doing at this table right now is strategizing how to get more women in their group. All right, isn't this how we often do it? We sit at really homogeneous tables. We don't talk to the communities we want to connect with, and then we try to figure out how to connect with them, right? But they finally get one. Whew, we got one. We're good. We're covered. We got a woman. And now imagine for the women in the room, it's you, okay? And your job is to go in there and help them see their sexism. Sound good? They said that's what they wanted. They said, oh, we might be missing things, so we want you to help us see what we're missing, or if there's any kind of sexism being perpetrated, point that out to us. Okay, so for the women in the room, just walking in that room, would the power be almost visceral to you? Their power, almost wafting off their bodies, right? And would it feel intimidating? Right? It would to me, right? Do you think they would notice or see themselves as having power? If you brought it up to them? I think they'd probably say, oh, no, we answer to our constituents. We don't have power. Oh, my wife rules the roost at home, ha ha. Okay? But you can see a lifetime of entitlement, a lifetime of being expected to lead, a lifetime of expecting yourself to be leading, a lifetime of seeing yourself as the most qualified to solve problems. You can feel it coming out of their pores, right? Okay? Right. So maybe a couple weeks in, you're noticing all kinds of sexism happening in that room. Do you think women in the room think you'd notice any? Right? From what happens when you contribute an idea, right, to how it goes into a void of silence, and then 10 minutes later one of these guys says it and it's a great idea, or every time you finally get a word in, you either get explained away, or that seems like the best time for half of them to go get a cup of coffee, or you realize that the real decisions get made at happy hour on the bar on the corner after work, but you don't think it's a good idea to go drinking after work as the only woman in this group, so you don't do that, but you miss out on the real networking, right? It's happening all over the place, and you're seeing it, and they asked you to help them, so you raise your hand and you say, hey, let me tell you guys how your sexism is manifesting. Think that's going to go well? When I look at that picture, I sincerely cannot imagine even one of those men being open to that. That's been my experience, right? So you think I'm ever going to do it again? I'm probably never going to do it again. I did it once, I tried, it didn't go well, I'm going to just get through this, right? And then imagine that eventually they think, well, maybe we need some training. Let's get some training. So, because they're having trouble getting any more women in the group, and the one they have is barely hanging in there, right? So they hire a male to come in and give them training. And right here, I'm not actually being facetious. I'm thinking they need a male trainer in there. There is no way, whether they're conscious of it or not, that they're going to grant as much legitimacy to a woman trying to tell them. I would, I'd say absolutely have, and a man can speak to it in a way that I couldn't, who can just say, look, come on, this is how it goes with us, you know this is how. Notice the way I do with white people, right? There's a reason I speak to it, because it's a shared reality that's harder to deny. Okay, so he's laying it out, and you're the one woman in there. Oh, by the way, leading up to the meeting, every time you're in the break room, you have to hear these guys bitterly complain about that training they have to have that nobody really needs. So you're not actually looking forward to the training. But the trainer's really good. He's laying it out, and you're thinking, "Whoa, man, he's got my back. He's naming this stuff. I'm gonna take a risk again." And you raise your hand, and you say, "Yeah, let me tell you what it's been like for me in here." And then the facilitator says, "Well, so how are you all hearing what Jane just shared?" Silence. Do you think Jane would be going, "This is going great"? How hostile would that silence feel? No matter what was driving it, my interpretation would be, ooh, hostility. That would not remotely feel supportive to me. And now imagine, eventually, one of these guys raises his hand and says, this is really hard for me to acknowledge, but wow, you have helped me see that I have participated in many things that have been exclusive to Jane. In fact, just the other day, here's something I did that I'm realizing was really not cool. Would you be, if you were Jane, would you be thinking, ha, there's the jerk? I'd be like, I love that guy. Oh, thank God, thank you. Now, that's the one I trust. None of the other ones are fooling me. Their carefulness is not conveying anything supportive to me. I'm not thinking, oh, they're cool, and this guy has sexism, and they don't. I'm going to now trust the one who is willing to meet me halfway, also be vulnerable, show himself, grapple. Right? And now imagine this meeting's over, and I'm out in the hall, and another guy comes up to me that I thought was my friend and says, I just want you to know that I agreed with what you said in there. Well, I'd say, well, that's nice to know, but where were you in there? Oh my God, the difference it would have made if you had spoken up in there. Why didn't you? And now look at the picture, and he says, oh, I didn't feel safe. And now some things would come out of my mouth that would be not for polite company. And I would, then the other thing I would say would be, what does it mean to be safe from a position of social, historical, institutional, cultural power and privilege? You're perfectly safe in that room. You did not want to break with white male solidarity. You did not want to break ranks. You didn't want to give any of that up. You don't talk to me about needing to feel safe in that room. Okay? So I'm hoping that the women in the room can relate to this example, right? Very, very clear about the dynamics when we're looking to get diversity. And if you can, if you're a white woman in this room and you do relate to that example, I want you now to imagine that this is the group. And these white women need a woman of color on their board. Women of color, you're going to sign up for that, to be the one to go in there and help these white women see their racism? Sound good? The same dynamics can be running in this room that I was experiencing in this room. I can be experiencing all kinds of silencing and exclusion and sexism in this room and be perpetrating the exact same thing to a person of color in this room. So I think about it in terms of saliency, right? Different identities are more or less salient in different contexts. And I do this as a call into white women because unfortunately we often use sexism, which I get. We are in a moment where it's clear as a bell that that sexism and patriarchy is being called out like never before. And we have feelings of resentment perhaps, and yet white women don't land any more softly on people of color. And I think in fact that the betrayal is greater and the hurt is deeper when white women don't back people of color. because we have a potential way in. We could potentially understand this. And this has been incredible help to me. When I don't understand something about racism, I just change the roles and I think, all right, imagine a man just said to me what I'm thinking of saying. Oh, got it. I got it. Right? So use it as a way in, not as a way out. We're coming to a close. And the number one question I get is, what do I do? Right? And that question has actually bothered me for a really long time, and I've had trouble articulating what about it bothers me, right? When that's white people's top question after a presentation like this. So I'm going to offer a question in response that might kind of reveal what bothers me about it, right? So if this is your question, what do I do? Then I have a question for you, and that is, what about your life has allowed you to be a full, functioning, professional, educated adult and not know what to do about racism? Why in 2018 is that your question, if indeed that is your question? And this is sincere, because if you sit down and you start to write out how you've managed not to know, it probably starts with, I wasn't educated. Well, there's your first step, right? I don't know anyone. I don't have conversations. There's your next step, etc., right? But we are in a moment where there is so much good information, and I think one of the very first things that white folks can do to break with the apathy of whiteness is take the initiative and find out. That one step of you taking the initiative to search out all of those resources is actually a really big breakthrough. I use the analogy of going to the doctor. A doctor says, oh, you have an acoustic neuroma. And then they get called out on an emergency and you got to go home and you're like, what the heck is that? What would you do? Google the shit out of it, wouldn't you? I mean, you'd be on every listserv, you'd watch the surgery, you'd get all opinions because you felt urgency, because you felt you cared enough to really get involved and take the initiative. And so that's kind of where we want to figure out, if I don't care enough, what's that about, right? However, I will leave you with a list. And a lot of it will direct you to my website, where there's just so much. There's even a program called Safety Pin Box where you can subscribe, and once a month they'll send you what you can do. Isn't that like perfect for white people? Just pay someone to tell you what to do? Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. It shows your commitment. And thank you for your attention. And I know you're going to have some really rich conversations this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you to United Philanthropy Forum for making the videos possible. With every video, there's a viewing guide and a discussion guide to facilitate your use of this resource. I really want to thank you for being a part of this learning series, for being a part of expanding the table for racial equity. And in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.